Sego, I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. If you are listening to us on radio, you are listening to us on WBAI in New York City or on WPFW in Washington, D.C., and I'm glad to have you. You may also be catching us on Facebook Live or perhaps on either one of the radio stations' a live stream. We also post this show up as a podcast, and you can find this podcast by asking your smart speaker to play Resistance Radio with John Kane, or you can also check out my Let's Talk Native program by asking your smart speaker to play Let's listen to Let's Talk Native with John Kane, and you'll catch a little bit different flavor. Look, I will say that I've got to reiterate some of what I did last week. I've got to talk more about this final report from the Interior Department on residential schools. I just got to do it. I warned folks early on that at some point this year, I was going to shift much of my attention towards residential schools. Man, I wish I had better news. I wish I could have, talked up, some great research done by the Interior Department. But unfortunately, what I'm going to talk about is kind of what I expected out of them. And that was not much. So I'm gonna. That's what I'm gonna do. But first, let me remind people that we are listener supported radio, and we do exist on radio only through your sponsorship. So I want to remind people that if you're listening to us on WPFW in Washington D.C., please go to the phone lines or go online and make a donation to the radio station in the name of this program. You can call 202-588-9739. That's 202-588-9739, or go online to wpfwfm.org/donate. If you're listening in New York City on WBAI, then I implore you to go to their pledge line, go to their website, and make a donation to that station in the name of Resistance Radio. And that number to call is 212-209-2950. That's 212-209-2950. Or go online to give2wbai.org and make a donation of any size. Make a one-time donation. You can make a timed donation. You can become a buddy on WBAI or a sustaining member on WPFW by making a commitment to allow your credit card or your checking account to be drawn from on a monthly basis. And it could be 5, 10, 15, 20, whatever amount that you can swing on a monthly basis. You can treat it as a subscription, as you do with some of your streaming services. Or you can just dig in and realize that what you're hearing on these stations is something you're not going to get anywhere else. And I know that what I'm delivering is not heard anywhere. And I don't mean just just on other radio stations or other radio programs. I know that I'm taking a stronger position on many of these native issues than you're going to hear anywhere else. I don't think that I'm an outlier. I don't think what I'm saying is unreasonable, but I'm not going to be snowed over. I'm not going to be swooned by what the contemporary or the common narrative is. So that's some of what I'm going to address today. And so those who may have caught last week's show, or especially for those who didn't, what I'm talking about is the Interior Department issued a final report, and it's the final report on the U.S. Indian boarding schools or Indian residential or native residential schools, what do you want to call them? And it is such a whitewash of information. It is the numbers. I mean, they characterize many of the numbers just with the precursor of at least. So they're not even giving a total number. They didn't do an investigation to come up with some grand total of deaths or abuses or even the number of students. They just grabbed the number and they claimed that it was at least this much. Then they calculated a number that they claimed the U.S. spent on these schools, and then tried to use that number as what should be used to compensate us in some manner or form or manner. And I'm going to talk more about that. They make 8 recommendations, and most of them are just pure, utter BS. There's no place in the recommendations, nor was there on the Canadian side, I might add, when they went through their Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address restoration of the lands lost during this period of time or restoration of the sovereignty or autonomy that was lost during this period of time. And there is no attempt to place any punitive or or any kind of value on the loss of life. And in fact, because the U.S. side won't even quantify, nor did the Canadian side quantify how many lives were lost, they couldn't possibly come up with a number. And then how much is a life worth? I mean, when we looked at the clergy sex abuse scandal, we saw little altar boys grown to full men who were getting millions of dollars individually suing the Catholic Church. We're not looking at that here. To be clear, the only number that I think may be somewhat accurate out of this report was the number that they came up with for the total number of schools, federally funded schools, which they came in at 417 schools. Here's one of the problems, even with that though. They talk about the schools in a time span from 1871 to 1969, almost 100 years. But they leave out the 50 years prior. The United States passed a congressional act called the I think it was called the Indian Civilization Fund Act. And it began to appropriate in 1819 dollars to be thrown at schools that were already grabbing up kids. I mean, they weren't necessarily, fully funded federal schools, but they were like church schools, mission schools that were grabbing up kids to save their souls. This started 1819. So they don't even address the 50 years prior to this 1871 figure or date. So as I'm looking at this number, and again, my buddy Ed Schindler used to say there's nothing he hated worse or more than anyone who would begin a sentence with "at least," because that's almost immediately a compromise. Well, at least he didn't do this, or at least he didn't do that, or at least she wasn't this, or at least, so it's like you're already saying, yes, what was done was terrible, but that's not even how at least is being used here. Here they're using at least as almost like a fictitious number. And here's what I'm talking about. They literally said that they have identified at least 18,000 students who were forced into these schools. Are you freaking kidding me? 417 schools, and that's not even counting the state-sponsored schools across 37 states or something like that for 100 years, and you're going to suggest only 18,000 students were at these schools, or children. I hate to even call them students, and I'm going to make that mistake because I can't somehow disassociate the word schools and students, but it's hard to call these kids students. They were enslaved. They were imprisoned in these schools. That's what they were. They were beaten, they were tortured, they were humiliated, and the whole function of the school, they said it in their slogan, kill the Indian. And they didn't mean just kill the individual. They wanted to kill us as a people. Kill the Indian, save the man. They said, look, if you could kill the Indian part of these creatures, then what remains might be a human being. That's literally what the policy was, and that's what it meant. And if that doesn't turn your stomach, I don't know what does. Perhaps the fact that little girls in these schools were turning up pregnant. Not just, and we're not just talking about pregnant by other students. We're talking about clergy. You think clergy sex abuse began with altar boys in the 1970s? No. It was going on for over 100 years before that, where the churches had unfettered access to every aspect of these Native kids' lives, with no parents involved. They actually had legal custody. They had power of attorney over these children, and there was no oversight. Oh yeah, there were a couple of reports that were done during the period these schools operated. But I don't even know if Deb Haaland and Brian Newland, who was the assistant secretary to Deb Haaland on the Interior Department, if they ever looked at any of those reports. They claim they traveled across the country and did listening sessions at, all over Indian country. And let me say this too, because sometimes this gets missed. When we're talking about 417 schools, we're talking about 22 that were in Alaska alone and 7 that were in Hawaii. Tiny little state like Hawaii. And they had 7 of these schools there. And again, where abuse was rampant, it was a part of the school culture. That's what it was. So they said at least 18,000. And let's be clear, it was probably closer to 100,000 or more. And there were periods of time where 85% of Native children had been ripped from their families. There were dates along that 100 years. And it wasn't, I'm not saying it was during the entire stretch of 100 years or 150 years going back to 1819. But where 85% of our kids were ripped out of our homes. And why were they? Well, they claimed that our homes were unsafe. The poverty, the conditions. And where did those come from? They were created by American policy too. So you create abject poverty amongst the people. I mean, to even call it third world conditions that still exist today, but I might add in many places, is it almost makes the notion of third world mean something completely different. I mean, the conditions that children and adults were forced to live on, because these so-called reservations weren't just lands that were ours. These were like prison camps. For much of this time, much of this 150 years, Native people couldn't leave them without getting a specific pass. And if they did, they could be considered hostiles and killed. So to suggest that this final report that uses numbers like or words like at least 18,000 students, and they say, oh, but we know that there was more, then why did you even say the number? Why even offer a paltry number like 18,000? And then they said, oh, and we've confirmed that there was 973 children who died, at least 900. Again, an insanely small number. On the Canadian side, they didn't have 400 schools. They had like 140. And through no help from Canada, many of these Native territories had begun the process of hiring engineering firms or working with engineering firms to bring in ground-penetrating radar to search out the land around these schools looking for unmarked graves. And to this point, it's almost 10,000 potential children buried in those sites. That's what the technology is saying. Now, I know some people are disputing that, but that's what the ground penetrating radar is indicating, that they have located as many as 10,000 graves. Now, we aren't just talking about unmarked. We're talking about mass graves in some cases. Now, some of these schools had they had graveyards with gravestones and crosses and all that stuff. Carlisle Indian School, they had established, groomed graveyards. And of course, the names on the gravestones were all biblical names. They weren't the original names of Native people. In fact, some of them, they didn't have names. They say unknown. How do you have a child in your school and you don't even know the name? A name to put on a gravestone? So, and they had over 200 marked graves. But I'll tell you something. It didn't stop there with Carlisle. I had a guest on my show a number of years ago, and I'm hoping to get him back here. He was a student at the time. He was studying for his master's, and he was doing work at Dartmouth, and now has moved on to University of California. He had done research on, I think, 4 residential schools, including Carlisle, but and he's continued this research. He's done an extensive report on it. Look up Preston McBride, and you'll find his report. It's like almost 1,000 pages long. But he determined that Carlisle alone was likely responsible for over 700 deaths. Because here's what Carlisle would do. Yeah, they had some marked graves, but they realized how badly that was playing out. So they started to send the deathly ill children home. Some of them never made it home. They died on the way. So what Preston McBride has determined was that Carlisle was probably responsible for an excess of 700 children dying, them themselves. And so how did they die? Well, let's talk about that. They died through neglect, mostly, but also through poor health care. And not just poor health care, almost health care designed to watch the spread of things like tuberculosis and some of the influenzas, the Spanish flu. The kids weren't quarantined. They weren't kept clean at all. Even minor injuries could be a death sentence for some of these kids. And they had absolutely unsafe work conditions, and they worked. These kids were like slaves. In the summer times, they didn't go home. They got sent out to be hired hands on farms or domestic servants and that kind of stuff with unsafe work conditions. So if they got injured or if they fell ill, even something that was treatable, they wouldn't get treated. And of course, there was abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and murder. I mean, is it murder if you throw a child down a flight of stairs and they die? Yes, that's murder. I'm not just talking about shooting, strangling, whatever, beating a child to death, and some of that stuff happened. There were also children who, like I said, young girls who got pregnant at the hands of staff. And what do? Even the Catholic Church, all of a sudden abortion was okay. They'd abort those babies and incinerate them. There's story after, I don't know what listening tour Deb Haaland was on, but I've heard story after story about children who were forced to throw remains in an incinerator, dig the graves for their fellow students. So I don't know what Deb Haaland was listening to while she was doing her listening tour. I said, but I'll tell you one thing. Deb Haaland is the most photographed Interior Secretary in the history of the United States. Look up Deb Haaland and don't even go to any of the stories. Just look for images. There are so many glorious pictures of Deb Haaland. She's literally the poster child for what anybody could promote as an Indian princess. That's what she was. She was tokenized from the very start, and I was always skeptical. Putting a Native person in those positions doesn't necessarily, and Brian Newland's Native too. Putting a Native person in those positions does not bode well for us because they work for them. This report is not just a whitewash, it's an appeasement. And look, the parties love to, the Republicans love to do congressional hearings on Democratic appointees. I guarantee that nobody's going to hold congressional hearings on this report. Why? Because neither party wants to accept responsibility for this crime. Neither one wants to do that. Neither one wants to have the truth come out. So let's use some numbers like at least 973 children died. Let's not tell the truth that it was probably 20,000. Let's use numbers like at least 18,000 students were forced to be, or kids were forced into these schools. Let's not tell the truth that it was probably in excess of 100,000. Let's say at least, 74 marked and unmarked grave burial sites were discovered. At least. I remember 417 schools, and again, you have to add almost probably another 100 schools that were funded by the state. In here, where I live on the Cattaraugus territory of Seneca Nation, Thomas Indian School. That was a state-run school. And, and these things all start with the best of intentions. Oh, it's because of the orphans and the kids who lost their parents or had unfit parents. Well, eventually, the Asher Wright family who started that thing with all these great intentions and, of course, Christianizing the kids. It's always got to be about assimilation. But while he may have had a kinder and gentler intent, eventually he realizes he can't afford this thing. So he starts seeking state funds. And then it shifts from being education funds and then being funded by the New York State Board of Charities. So now all of a sudden, Native children are not being looked at as students. They're being looked at as invalids. They call these schools asylums. they were characterizing Native children as irredeemable. So let's just teach them something to give them some value in American society. That's irredeemable children of New York. That's what the Board of Charities called them. Our kids were being considered handicapped, mentally disabled, simply by virtue of being Native. I don't think racism is a strong enough word. I don't know what the right word is. But we know what was done at these schools is almost the definition of genocide. I say it every time I bring this up, but I got to say it again. There are 5 overt acts that qualify each individually. Each individual act qualifies as genocide, a crime that is punishable in the international courts and actually requires punishment. And that includes killing a people with the intent. And of course, all of this has to do with the intent. Were children killed with the intent to make the people disappear? Yes. The whole school system, the whole assimilation policy, what the intent was to eliminate us. That's why they say kill the Indian, save the man. They mean kill the Indian and produce an American is what they mean. That's what they mean. So yes, children were killed. They were abused, physically abused, sexually abused, psychologically abused. They were harmed with the intent to eliminate their autonomy, their distinction, their identities. The conditions of these schools was the entire apparatus was geared with the intent to eliminate us. Those are 3 of them. The other 2 are sterilization, guilty again. Sterilization is exactly what these schools had done to these young ladies and girls. And of course, the other thing is the physical taking of children with the intent. Again, every one of these have to have the intent in there to eliminate us. And all five criteria for genocide is what these schools enlisted as a part of their strategy. And the United States has never been held accountable. And the worst part is, coming out of the gate with this report, Deb Haaland says, this is the first time the United States has demonstrated accountability for what they did. I can't say bullshit strongly enough. I'm sorry. I just can't say it strongly enough. And it's incredible that they produced this report with these at least in there. And of course, I got to tell you, that's not even the worst part. As I mentioned last week, I'm going to get into it right now. Here's the worst part. Again, they left off the first 50 years, but they decided they wanted to come up with a number, a dollar value. So they decided they were going to look at how much money Congress and the federal government had appropriated to commit this genocide through these schools. How much did they appropriate for the purchase, the building, the operation, the maintenance of these schools? They adjusted it, and they didn't adjust it to 2024 inflation rates. No, they adjusted it to last year because, let's face it, it would have been an even bigger number. They come up with $23.3 billion. And you know what? Every time I mention this number, somebody says, wow, $23.3 billion? That's a big number. No, it isn't. It's a paltry number. And since when do you even entertain the idea of trying to put a price tag that was ultimately going to be used as some sort of starting place for compensation by calculating the cost of committing the crime? I mean, can you imagine if all anybody ever had to do was say, well, yes, I'm guilty of this crime, and it cost me this much to perpetrate the crime, and so I'll accept that as a punishment. Can you even imagine such an absurd proposition? This is exactly what Deb Haaland and Brian Newland did. They didn't assess harm. They didn't assess damages. How could they? They wouldn't even come up with a real number. They stuck with these at least numbers. So they couldn't even begin to assess damages. They didn't begin to assess damages. Instead, they said, we're going to assess cost. What did it cost us to do this? I mean, can you even imagine anything more ludicrous than that? And they said, we want this, and this was the language they used. They literally said that this $23.3 billion, and they advocated spending an equivalent amount to somehow right the wrong. $23.3 billion for what? For murder and the torture, and the ultimate goal was genocide. Well, that's a pretty cheap genocide, folks. You got off pretty cheap. You don't have to, that's all you're going to have to pay? And you know what? They were hedging on that number. In fact, they tried to say, well, we wouldn't have to spend it all at once either. We could stretch it out over time. Well, we paid it over time. That's $23 billion over 100 years. So we can spend the next 100 years putting $23 billion back into their what? Well, I'll tell you what they were talking about. Their recommendations included an apology. Let's apologize. Let's apologize for what we did. Yeah, that was one. That was their first recommendation. I'm gonna pull it up here. I got to do this. I mean, it is absolutely remarkable that they could do something like this. I mean, it is just incredible. So, yeah, they've got issuing a formal acknowledgement and apology from the United States government regarding its role in adopting and implementing the National Federal Indian Boarding School policies. Number 2, investing in the remedies to present-day impacts of the federal Indian boarding school system. So they aren't even going to pretend to address the harm. They're going to say, well, let's put a number. Let's throw some money at what we think we can currently identify is the impacts for what we did for 150 years. No restoration of lands. Well, I take it back. Let me go through the list here. Investing in let me see what we got. Investing in remedies to establishing a national memorial, a monument. So they want to build a monument to what they did. I mean, is that a monument to us or a monument to them? Establishing a national memorial to acknowledge and commemorate the experiences. Really? That's number 3. Number 4, identifying and repatriating the remains of children. You guys won't even determine how many children actually died. 973? So, and I'm not even sure that's what everybody wants. I tell you what people want. They want real numbers. They don't want an at least number. Returning the former Indian boarding schools sites to the tribes. Well, so they're not going to talk about real land back. They're just going to say, you know what? We're going to give you the land where we did all these. We're going to give the crime scenes back to you. I know many Native people are just totally creeped out by the idea that these sites, these buildings, should remain. So we're gonna give you the school sites back. Well, I guess then we can finally dig them up and find out how many children they buried there. So number 6 is telling the story of federal Indian boarding schools to the American people. That's what this report's supposed to do, and it doesn't. I mean, it's basically a lie. It's basically a lie. Oh, then there's another investing in further research regarding the present-day health and economic impacts. So they don't want to address the health. They want to invest in the research. Again, this is what they plan to do with this $23 billion. They're going to pay their people to do research. I mean, I read this thing and I just get angry all over again. And here's I love this one. Here's number 8. Advancing international relationships in other countries with similar but their own unique histories of boarding schools or other assimilation policies. You want to compare notes with what other countries have done to our people? You're not even talking about the remedies. That's not what you're comparing. This is no. We're going to advance international relationships with other countries who also did this. Why? So you can water down and make. See, it wasn't us alone. We've got Canada. We got New Zealand, Australia. We got countries in South America. We got countries in Africa. See, it wasn't just no. You set the standard, United States. You set the standard for this. Everybody else followed you, and you bragged about it. You went to other countries offering your ingenious, what did they used to, what did they call it? Oh, the superior genius of your European stock. You spread to all these other countries. It was you. And yes, other countries did it. I don't know if they did it worse or better, depending on how you want to qualify it. During that period of time, our numbers had depleted in terms of total population. Of course they did. They sterilized our women, our young girls. They broke up families. Many of these children would never return home. Why? Because they had no home to return to. They had no parents to return to. The crime that was committed over generations, 150 years, 100 years of building the schools, funding the schools, collaborating with the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches to run these schools. What was done to those children, you can't put a price tag on, but you sure as hell don't put a price tag on what it costs you to do it. I mean, I'm just outraged at the notion that they think they can, because it was an easy number to come up with. Look, you got the bills, you got the receipts for it, right? But instead of trying to look at the harm, the damages. I mean, there are law firms that do this. They assign damages for what happens to an injured party. It's not like this hasn't been done before. But if you think you did a listening tour and this is what you came up with, Deb Haaland, you should be ashamed of yourself. And you know what? Any of you Native people in particular, and I'm not even talking about Democrat, Republican stuff here. Any of you Native people who are still endorsing this woman as some princess of, looking out for us, I got to tell you, I'm disgusted. I am disgusted by what this report says. And I'll admit, I haven't read the thing cover to cover. And when I do, I'm going to pull out every piece of it, and we're going to do more shows on it. But look, NPR did a story on it. Look up NPR's coverage of the final report, and just read it. Read how it was characterized by NPR News. I mean, this thing is being praised by the media. And you know what? There are Native people thinking $23 billion? Man, if I can get a piece of that. Well, first off, let me remind people. The Cabell suit, this class action suit started by a woman named Eloise Cabell. At some point, there were some estimates that the United States had misappropriated, lost, or stolen over $100 billion worth of Native assets. And it was done through a variety of ways, everything from nepotism to, just giving stuff away, pennies on the dollar, depleting minerals and timber and water, all kinds of stuff, grazing rights. But there were some estimates that were as high as $100 billion. The George W. Bush administration had thrown a number around at around $40 billion, thinking, well, this is where we got to settle. The Obama Biden administration settled it for $4 billion. So if you're looking at $23 billion and think, oh yeah, we're going to get that, no, you're not. It's going to go for one thing. I don't believe the United States is going to come off of $23 billion, and to the extent that they do and they stretch it out over decades, that money's going to get swallowed up in United States bureaucracy, governmental bureaucracy, and not even ours. But even if it did get swallowed up in ours, we got native people that are working hand in hand with the federal government on this stuff. There is no way, again, let me say this again, there is no way that you could consider the cost of perpetrating a crime as the dollar demarcation for what should be used to compensate, to justly compensate the victims of that crime. I mean, it's like telling me that, yeah, I killed him with a crowbar, but and that crowbar cost me $20. I mean, I don't have enough hair on my head to pull out. I mean, this is how absurd this is. And the United States created the conditions that they claim they were saving these children from. And some of those conditions still exist on native territories. Look, we have the highest suicide rates. They actually list suicide when they're looking at the lethality of these schools. When McBride and others were doing these studies, they listed suicide as almost like one of the ailments. And it is. I mean, it's a mental health issue. So if children killed themselves at these schools, I'm sorry, I still look at that as a homicide perpetrated by those who administered these schools. There were children who froze to death trying to escape these schools, died of exposure. I mean, we still have a missing and murdered indigenous women, girls, children, Two-Spirit. I mean, we still have, indigenous people turning up missing today. So I know that even if they did the research, they'll probably never be able to have a concrete number on how many children died at these schools. They don't keep track of how many people are dying today, let alone over the past 150 years. So I'm outraged. I am absolutely outraged by this. And I know people are talking about Kamala Harris and, Tim Walz and still talking about Gaza. And it's amazing to me. I believe what Palestinians are experiencing in Gaza at the hands of Israel is absolutely terrible. It's an absolute heinous crime. But you don't have to look at Israel for that. You can look at your government officials today. And George Washington, the first president of the United States, literally wanted the Seneca people to know the terror of their chastisement. He literally documented terrorism as a military strategy for the birth of this nation. And yet we throw the word terrorist around today like it's always somebody else, right? That's what the United States does. Well, we know who the terrorists were. We know, people talk about Boko Haram, kidnapping all these school children. Well, what the hell do you think you did? For 150 years. Reggie, I want to take some calls. I don't know, Reggie, if you're there.
I am here, John. I'm just listening to you just like everyone else is.
You're just notably silent, Reggie. I must have you just sitting there with your jaw dropped.
No, it's not that. More often than not, we're on the same page with a lot of things, and I'm just agreeing silently, and I'm just making notes on, yet again, There was a speech that I played on my program a couple of times, and it easily could apply with the native point of view as well. And the speech goes off as saying, "Black faces in high places won't save you," and it's it's on point with this as well.
Yeah, red
So
faces won't either. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, yeah. Well, and I don't know if you, I posted a quote by James Baldwin. He was debating William F. Buckley or something like that at some debate society in England, and in his final notes he said, "We're not wards. We are not your wards." Man,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I got to get Native people to say that.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I go after this notion of the trust doctrine and trust responsibility and trust land and trust. I don't trust them. I mean,
Right.
so, and we never asked them to be our trustees. Yeah, there are Native people all over the country, all Hawaii, Alaska, all over the,
Right.
all over, that look to their colonizers as their trustees, as if we are still wards of the state. Well, we're not.
And as if the opposition is doing a favor for them.
Well, and
That's the
see,
crazy part.
this is where you know I started talking last year about delving into the residential schools. That there had to be a conversation about restoration, not reconciliation, not throwing some money at language programs or doing
Right.
research on the economic impacts that you had. I mean, for one thing, the these residential schools, they still were only part of a policy of genocide. I mean, they were genocide all by themselves,
Mm-hmm.
but what was being done, the whole reservation system that the United States established, was geared towards destroying us. It was to make our lives insufferable. So
Mm-hmm.
we would assimilate. That's what the whole goal was. And when it wasn't working
Right.
fast enough, they said, let's just scoop up all their children. Let's just grab all their children. These damn native people just won't cooperate. And that's literally what they were saying.
Right. Right.
I'd like to take a few calls. I'm hoping that. Yeah, and look, if you're going to call in on this show, I usually say, look, talk about anything you want to talk about. But I want to hear some response to what I just ranted about.
So you're specific on this one. You
Yeah,
want people
I'd
to
like to
focus
have
on the
callers,
subject matter.
respond.
All right. Let it be known. Let it be known.
And look, attack me if you want. I don't care. I just want to hear some. I mean, because nobody's talking about this. And look,
Right.
if I'm just speaking in the wind here, and nobody's getting upset, if I'm not angering somebody, then I'm not doing my job. I'm just not doing my job. So, all right. So the line to call in is 212-209-2877. That's
Correct.
212-209-2877. Look, if you want to weigh in on this report, or at least what I'm telling you about this, I'm sure many of you haven't read the report, but you can look at the end. I mean, everybody thinks the NPR is going to be the fairest, right? No, I mean, maybe they are the fairest, but that gives you an idea
Well,
just how unfair the coverage has been.
Well, they're implementing the hegemon in a nice docile tone with maybe Bach and Beethoven in the background.
No, you got to put some flute music. You got to have flute music in the background. Come on, Reggie.
Yeah, sure. You know what? You're right. You're absolutely correct.
And you got to have Deb
the
Haaland
docile-
in a ribbon skirt. She's got to. The fact that we laugh about this is just how absurd some of this is.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is.
Absolutely.
It is absolutely absurd. All right. Is anybody on the line yet? Let me give the number.
Not yet. I'll let you know. I'll let you know.
Okay.
212-209-2877 callers. You have an opportunity to speak with John and focus on the subject matter that he mentioned during this whole hour. 212-209-2877. Don't be shy. I know a lot of y'all aren't.
I get it. Some people are going to be speechless. I mean, I get it. I don't blame you. I don't blame you because it took me a little bit. And I was expecting this report to suck. I mean, I really was. But then when I saw what they did with coming up with this $23 billion, I'm just like, are you freaking kidding me? I mean, Reggie, can you imagine the gall in this in coming up with a number based on how much you spent to commit the crime? I mean, I can't even wrap my head fully around this thing. I mean, it's absurd beyond, you know. And look, and I'm asking people to think critically. You don't even need to
Right.
think critically to look at this. I mean,
Right.
just imagine, just imagine for a second if justice was determined by how much it cost to commit the injustice, rather than what the injustice does to somebody. I mean, can you even imagine that?
Oh my God! You're going into a rabbit hole that is hurting my head.
I mean, can you imagine if you
My
killed somebody with your
God!
car and you only had to
My
pay,
goodness!
or you disabled somebody for life with your car and you only had to pay them the value of your car? I mean, can you
And
imagine? I mean,
but it's as ridiculous and audacious that sounds. You're on point. It does exist. There's a world there. It exists where something like that could happen. And with that said, John, we do have callers on the line, and they're ready to share some opinions and thoughts with you.
all right, let's go. Caller, you're up first. You're number one. Give me your name and where you're calling from. And look, you can criticize what I've said here, and I'm not opposed to that. But go ahead, caller. You're up first. What's your name?
Cruz.
Hey, Cruz.
Calling
Thanks for
you,
calling.
John.
Oh, Cruz. Okay.
I think I'm safe with you.
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to say was I wanted to add to your conversation is that you just stated right now, the amount of money. I think it's setting precedence for right now this study on reparations for the African American community, right? So you guys are the linchpin, right? So look at the pittance they gave you all, and you are the actual natives of this land, right? As opposed to people that were brought here. So there you go. This is just like a note for those seeking, well, formerly enslaved,
Oh no, I got
ancestry
the formula
Black
for
Americans.
them. I got the formula for them. All I got to do
Yeah,
is determine
absolutely.
how much they would be sold for as a slave, and that's what you
Absolutely. That's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to do that because they're not original. What you just spoke about, they have exported that supremacy ideology throughout the beginning of time, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, why should the, compensation change? The method of compensation change for anybody else. So, yep.
This is
That's
this is
what I
what
wanted
this
to
is what their
say.
final report said. The final report seeks to put a price on that action, arguing that the government could begin to remedy the trauma inflicted in over a century of forced assimilation by investing on a scale that is commensurate with the investments made to commit the crime. I mean, it's
Well,
they
you're lucky
literally
they're not
write
making
it.
you all pay for that.
Oh my
Oh,
goodness.
They should pay, make you all pay for that,
And
too, right?
mm, mm,
They have to spend money to do that.
mm,
I've just to read it, it sticks in my throat. And to think that they thought they could write this, and it was okay. And you know what? And I gotta say it is okay for some people. And I guarantee there will not be congressional hearings chewing this up.
no,
There will be nobody.
Sadly,
There will be
no.
nobody says, where the hell did you come up with that number and believe that the cost of committing the crime is what should be? I mean, because they're shocked by 23 billion. Forget about 23 trillion or whatever the real number should be. I mean, I challenge any law firm that has ever sought damages for, something that could be as damaging as this. And of course, there is nothing as damaging as this. But you just take a piece of it. Take one school and assess the damage that they did to the children in one school. Take Carlisle and assess the harm that they did by allowing 700 children to die and doing what they did. And let's not forget what Carlisle did. Carlisle exploited children, guys like Jim Thorpe. They use sports as a way to say, look how effective our assimilation is. We can put a bunch of boys to play against men in football and be competitive. I mean, that's the level of abuse goes in so many different directions that it's insane. Cruz, I want to thank you for the call. Let's see if there's anybody else who wants to weigh in. I'm just going to keep railing about this. So, caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but talk real close to your phone, and speak as loud as you can.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. You're faint, but I hear you.
Okay. So, yeah, John, I'm calling. It's Helen from Hillsdale, New Jersey, and I just want to say that I've been listening to your show for years, and I want to thank you for educating me because I was, like so many out there, were so ignorant about what took place with Native Americans in the country. And we don't get this information. I certainly didn't in my school. But what I want to say is this. Not only do I believe what you said about what they did to the children, and I can see people saying on some level, hey, I'm not Native American. Okay, next problem or whatever. But what people don't realize is that what they did to the Native American children in the same, a different but similar diabolical, disgusting way they're doing now to our children in schools and whatnot, confusing them about their gender. And somebody might say, what does that have to do? Yes, it is. When they are coming after our kids, all of our kids, black, white, confused about their race, whatever.
Here's what I'm going to tell you. I think the better comparison is how that period of time predated and yet carried on with the clergy sex abuse scandals. That is rocked not just the Catholic Church, not just the Protestant churches that have been involved in everything from adoption agencies, foster care, all the. I mean, and for all kids. I mean, Native kids. I mean, when they ended residential schools, some of the same stuff continued through foster care. When Maine did their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it wasn't over residential schools; it was over foster care and adoptions. So, I mean, I look. I don't know. I don't necessarily agree that public schools are going after our children, but I think there are predators that have been allowed to in our public schools and in private schools, in churches and in institutions, including prisons and reform schools, adoption agencies. The amount of abuse that kids and Native kids in particular have experienced, it just continues. Reggie, I don't even have time for another call, but I want to thank you for patiently listening. We're going to have more conversations about this, and look, I am not going to make any apologies for continuing to harp on this. This is a big deal, and until I start feeling like this is being heard, I'm going to keep talking about it. So I want to thank you for joining me. For those who called in, I want to thank you, Reggie. And I'm going to keep going with this stuff. I mean, I have other issues to
As
talk
you
about.
should.
I got other
As
issues.
you should.
But this is not a one and done deal. This is not a one and done deal. I will continue to harp on this. I'm going to try to bring in some guests that can speak from other perspectives on this thing. But we're going to keep going with this. I want to thank you for listening. I am John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. Yahweh.